Sophia Hart had spent the last 3 years buried in the heart of military journalism, documenting the movements of soldiers and the strategies of generals, her work often appearing in the most respected defense publications. Yet on this particular day, she was unaware that her life was about to shift from observer to protagonist, from recorder of history to part of it herself. The cargo hold of the massive transport aircraft hummed with the steady rhythm of 4 powerful engines. The kind of mechanical symphony Sophia knew all too well. She sat in her assigned seat, camera bag resting against her knee, fingers curled loosely around her notepad. The scene around her was an almost perfect representation of unity in the armed forces, Navy specialists sharing quiet words with Marine recon veterans, young Army lieutenants leaning forward to trade stories with weathered Air Force crew members, each face carrying its own history of service. Sophia was known among Pentagon press circles as the journalist who never missed a detail. Auburn hair loosely tied back, sharp blue eyes scanning her surroundings with unbroken focus. She could extract a complete narrative from the smallest of gestures. Her skill had earned her a place on missions most reporters never experienced. She knew the procedures, the terminology, and the culture well enough to blend in. Yet there was one thing none of her colleagues, or even most military personnel around her knew. A dozen years earlier, before she was the composed journalist with a camera, Sophia Hart had been Major Sophia Steele, one of the most respected pilots in the United States Air Force. She had flown everything from massive cargo transports to agile fighter jets, logging over 8,000 hours in the air. She had completed 3 combat deployments, earning medals that others might display proudly. But those accolades were now tucked away in a small wooden box at the back of her closet, unseen and unmentioned. Her squadron mates had once called her Silver Hawk, a nickname born from her ability to keep calm in storms both literal and metaphorical. She was the officer assigned the most challenging missions, the kind others hesitated to accept, but the Sophia of today was different. Her uniform replaced by a tailored jacket and press badge. Her mission now to tell stories, not to fly them. Still, there were moments, like now, when the low vibration of the aircraft through the soles of her boots triggered something deep in her memory. A reminder of nights flying over endless deserts, the cockpit lit only by the green glow of instruments, the soft crackle of radio chatter in her ears. She would shake off the sensation quickly, telling herself those days were behind her, that her service had taken a new form. Today's assignment seemed simple enough. The Department of Defense was transferring 200 military personnel to a training facility in Nevada. Sophia's role was to document the joint nature of the exercise, to highlight the cooperation between various branches. She would take photographs, conduct interviews, and later craft a feature story that painted a picture of unity and readiness. The crew of the aircraft was skilled and experienced. Captain Robert Mason, a 15-year veteran pilot, commanded the flight. His co-pilot Emma Lewis had 5 years of experience and a reputation for precision. Supporting them was Staff Sergeant Daniel Rivera as loadmaster and Technical Sergeant Michael Turner managing flight engineering. Under normal conditions, Sophia knew this crew was more than capable of handling any challenge. The aircraft was a C-130 Hercules, a beast of a machine with the kind of durability that made it the backbone of many operations. It could take off and land in places most planes would never attempt, its 4 engines producing the kind of power that reassured even the most anxious passenger. Sophia had flown this model before, knew its personality, its strengths, and its quirks, but that was a lifetime ago. As the flight settled into its routine rhythm, Sophia moved between rows, exchanging a few quiet words with those willing to be interviewed, jotting notes about their backgrounds and current roles, her lens capturing images of camaraderie and quiet readiness. She kept her focus on the story at hand, not on the slight pull in her chest when she glanced toward the cockpit. She reminded herself that she was here to observe, not to interfere, that the aircraft's operation was in the hands of others now. Her job was to chronicle, to witness, and later to translate moments into words for those who would never step into a cargo hold like this. But somewhere deep in her mind, a dormant readiness remained, silent but intact, waiting for a reason to wake. In that moment, Sophia could not have known that within the next hour, this quiet assignment would dissolve into chaos, that the lives of every single person on board would hang on decisions made in seconds, and that she would once again find herself in a position she had sworn she would never return to. For now, the engines roared steadily. The air smelled faintly of fuel and machine oil, and the horizon ahead promised nothing more than blue sky. Sophia adjusted her notepad, checked the camera settings, and prepared to capture the story she believed she was here to tell. Long before the press badge ever hung around her neck, Sophia Hart had lived a life measured not in published stories, but in flight hours and missions completed. Back then, she was not the woman quietly taking photographs in the cargo hold. She was the one in the cockpit wearing a headset, her eyes locked on the horizon and her hands steady on the controls of machines that seemed too massive to leave the ground. Her journey to the sky had started with a determination that had surprised even her closest friends. She had entered the Air Force Academy at the top of her class, driven by a mix of curiosity and a need to prove herself in a world that doubted her resolve. Flight training had been grueling, every day a test of both mind and body. Yet Sophia had thrived, not because it was easy, but because the challenge sharpened her in ways she had never known possible. By the time she earned her wings, she was already a name whispered with respect among instructors and peers. Silverhawk, they called her, a nod to the way she could cut through turbulence and storms as if the air itself bent to her will. Her assignments took her from heavy transport planes like the C-130 Hercules to the speed and precision of fighter jets, each aircraft adding another layer to her skill set. But there was one mission that would mark her life forever, a mission not written in any official public record. It happened during her third deployment, deep in the stretch of Afghanistan where the nights were so dark that the stars seemed close enough to touch. Sophia had been assigned to pilot a C-130 on a medical evacuation from Kabul to a forward base. The cargo hold that night was filled with 47 wounded soldiers, each one depending on her to get them out of danger and into the care they desperately needed. Enemy fire had already touched the base before they could take off, the sound of rockets in the distance mixing with urgent orders from the crew as they lifted into the sky under a blanket of zero visibility. The situation worsened. An RPG struck the aircraft mid-climb, tearing through one of the engines and damaging the hydraulic system. Alarms screamed through the cockpit, the kind that demand instant action. Sophia's mind shifted into a place she could only describe as pure focus. Every thought narrowed to the instruments, the feel of the controls, and the invisible path she had to carve through the darkness. She flew on one functional engine, manually controlling the massive aircraft through enemy fire, her crew working with precise coordination despite the chaos. Below her feet, the wounded waited in silence and pain, trusting her without ever seeing her face. The landing strip at the forward base was nothing more than a rugged patch of desert with no lights, no markers, and no room for error. The wind howled through the open terrain as she descended, guiding the damaged plane toward the ground with every bit of skill and instinct she possessed. The touchdown was rough but controlled, the aircraft groaning as it slowed. When it finally stopped, all 47 soldiers were still alive. In the days that followed, she was awarded the Bronze Star Medal, her name mentioned in briefing rooms as an example of courage under fire. The press labeled her a hero, though she avoided the attention. What they could not see were the nights that came afterward. The way she would wake in the dark with the memory of alarms ringing in her ears, the weight of 47 lives pressing against her chest. The Air Force moved to fast-track her for promotion, but something inside her had shifted. The pride of survival was tangled with a relentless question that haunted her. What if she had failed? What if one wrong move had taken them all? The sleepless nights turned into long stretches of anxiety, her hands still steady in flight, but her mind restless in the quiet hours. 6 months later, Sophia requested medical leave, and 3 months after that, she made the decision that shocked her commanding officers. She applied for early retirement. They asked her why she would leave at the peak of her career. She only told them she wanted to serve in another way. She did not explain that the sound of a cockpit alarm had become something she could not escape, even in silence. Her life changed quickly after leaving the Air Force. She traded her flight suit for civilian clothes and her cockpit for a press pass. She became a military affairs correspondent for the Pentagon Press Corps. Learning to observe from the outside rather than command from within, she covered operations, interviewed commanders, and reported on national security issues, her writing sharp and informed by experience. Yet she never told anyone the full truth. Her resume simply listed former Air Force officer with no hint of her flight record, no mention of the call sign Silver Hawk or the medals hidden away. Even those who had once served beside her in the Air Force did not connect the comm journalist with the pilot who had landed a crippled C-130 in darkness. She told herself the past was behind her, that she had found a new mission, but deep inside, she knew that the skills she had built over years of service were still there, waiting quietly, and though she would not admit it then, some part of her was still a pilot. What she could not have imagined was that fate would hand her another test, one that would arrive without warning in the form of a routine flight that would soon become anything but routine. The afternoon sun filtered through the small circular windows of the aircraft, casting pale beams across the faces of soldiers and specialists strapped into their seats. The air was filled with a steady vibration that only a transport plane like the C-130 Hercules could produce, a deep rhythmic pulse that traveled up through the boots of everyone aboard. For most, it was a reassuring sound. For Sophia Hart, it carried a strange familiarity, a sound that echoed with pieces of her past. She had been assigned to this mission as part of a feature piece documenting cooperation between different military branches. The cargo hold around her was a patchwork of uniforms and insignias, Army Rangers with focused eyes, Navy divers speaking in low tones, Air Force technicians adjusting gear straps, and Marine recon veterans sitting quietly as if measuring the weight of the journey ahead. There was a mix of youth and experience in every row, each person carrying their own unspoken stories. Sophia had been taking notes for the last hour, moving between groups when allowed, catching brief introductions, recording details she could shape into a narrative later. The crew was professional and confident. Captain Robert Mason, in the left seat of the cockpit, had 15 years of flying the Hercules. His reputation was that of a man who treated every flight with methodical precision. Beside him was First Lieutenant Emma Lewis, a skilled and disciplined co-pilot who had earned the respect of her peers quickly. Behind them, Sergeant Daniel Rivera handled loadmaster duties, while Technical Sergeant Michael Turner monitored the engineering systems. Everything about the mission felt routine. The engines droned in a steady tempo. The cargo straps held tight. The conversations were calm and scattered. Sophia had just sat down again and started to adjust the lens on her camera when it happened. A sharp metallic crack tore through the hum of the engines. The entire aircraft jolted to the left, head snapped upward, hands gripped armrests. She felt the shift in her chest before she even fully registered the sound. One of the engines had failed. She knew the C-130 could keep flying on 3 without much trouble, but her mind was already calculating what that meant for fuel balance and control. The captain's voice came over the intercom, with the kind of calm that was meant to steady nerves. He reported a mechanical malfunction and assured everyone they were trained for it. Still, in the eyes of several battle-hardened passengers, there was a flicker of recognition. They knew losing an engine at altitude was never ideal. Then came the second impact, a shudder that rattled the frame and cut deep into the reassuring rhythm of the flight. The second engine failure was immediate and brutal. Sophia felt the aircraft lose part of its fight against gravity. She glanced at the faces around her, reading the expressions like a second language. Even the most seasoned among them now carried a hint of unease. Sergeant Rivera passed by her seat with his voice low enough that only she could hear, telling her they had just lost 2 engines and that it was not good. The descent was gradual but steady, and Sophia's instincts, dormant for years, began to stir. She could feel the shift in altitude in her bones, the subtle way the air pressure changed. The aircraft was still flyable, but the margin for error had narrowed sharply. She leaned forward, listening to the muffled but urgent communication coming from the cockpit. The words Mayday and dual engine failure were unmistakable, along with the number of souls on board, 203. Before anyone could fully process the situation, a new emergency unfolded. Captain Mason collapsed in his seat, his head dropping forward against the harness. The co-pilot reacted instantly, tried to wake him, calling for a medic over the intercom. Voices in the cargo hold rose. Heads turned toward the cockpit door. Sophia could hear the edge of panic in the co-pilot's transmissions. She was now the only one in the cockpit able to control the aircraft, but Sophia also knew the complexity of their situation. Dual engine failure in a C-130 was difficult even for the most experienced crews, and now the aircraft commander was down. The weight of the moment pressed into Sophia. She looked down the rows of passengers, men and women who had survived war zones, special forces operatives who had moved unseen through hostile cities, intelligence officers who had planned missions on razor-thin margins. Yet here they sat as powerless as any civilian on a troubled flight. Her mind was already working through possibilities: fuel remaining, altitude, glide range, nearest suitable landing strips. She felt her heartbeat steady rather than race. The same shift she had felt years ago over Afghanistan when the night sky was filled with fire. It was a focus that left no room for fear, only action. In the seconds that followed, she made the decision that would pull her out of the role of journalist and place her back into the seat she had once commanded. She placed her notepad on the seat beside her, unbuckled, and began moving toward the cockpit. Sergeant Rivera stepped in her path, telling her no one could enter during an emergency. Sophia's voice carried a tone that cut through the noise of the cargo hold, her words identifying her as a former Air Force major and pilot, the most experienced one on the aircraft now. Rivera hesitated but moved aside, his eyes wide with the sudden understanding that the quiet journalist he had seen taking notes was something else entirely. Sophia stepped into the cockpit where Lieutenant Lewis was wrestling with the controls, the panels flashing warnings, the air thick with urgency. And without hesitation, Sophia took the seat that had been empty for far too long. The cockpit felt different from the cargo hold, smaller, more urgent. The sound of the engines now uneven, the vibration telling a story of imbalance and strain. Sophia slid into the seat beside Lieutenant Emma Lewis and let her eyes sweep over the instrument panel. Altitude just above 11,000 feet and dropping. 2 engines dead. The other 2 holding steady for now. Hydraulics intact, controls still responsive. It was enough to work with, but not enough to waste a second. Emma was breathing quickly, hands steady but tense on the yoke, her voice tight as she asked who Sophia was. The answer came without hesitation: former C-130 pilot. Here to help. Sophia's tone was calm, but carried a quiet authority that filled the small space. She requested a full situation report, listened without interrupting, then took over radio communications, her voice cutting through static with the precision of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. She informed air traffic control of the captain's medical incapacitation, the dual engine failure, and the exact number of souls on board. The controller's response offered 2 options: Dover Air Force Base nearly 90 miles northeast, or a civilian airport about 67 miles away. Sophia's mind ran the numbers: altitude, glide ratio, wind direction. She knew they would never make 90 miles. 67 was the outer edge of possibility. Every foot of altitude now had value. She chose Dover, not because it was closer, but because the base had the equipment and emergency crews ready for a military transport in distress. She declared a full emergency. Emergency vehicles placed on standby, runway prepared, all focused now on keeping the aircraft flying long enough to get there. Turning to Emma, she gave direct instructions, calling her by name, making her the co-pilot in more than title. Sophia took the primary controls, easing the Hercules into its optimal glide speed. She ordered fuel dumping to reduce weight, checked the balance across the remaining operational engines, and monitored every minor shift in the control field. Outside the cockpit, the sky stretched ahead in pale blue layers, every mile bringing them closer, but also cutting into their altitude. In the cargo hold, the atmosphere had changed. Word was moving through the ranks that someone up front knew exactly what to do. Soldiers who had spent years in combat zones now sat in silence. Eyes forward, seatbelt secure, the quiet broken only by the low hum of emergency preparation. Gear tightened, loose equipment stowed, each person running through the motions of readiness without needing to be told. The minutes passed in a way that felt both fast and stretched, the kind of time that only exists when every choice is critical. Sophia's mind was calm but alive, each decision feeding the next. Angle of descent, rate of speed, the exact moment to begin final approach. She spoke little, her instructions short and clear. Emma responding instantly, the two functioning as if they had flown together for years. At last Dover appeared ahead, a long strip of asphalt surrounded by open fields. The control tower gave wind speed and clearance. Sophia aligned the approach, adjusting for the crosswind, the massive plane descending steadily, two engines fighting against drag and gravity. Inside the cockpit, every movement was measured, flaps set at the exact moment needed, speed trimmed for the safest landing possible. The wheels met the runway with a solid weight, the flare executed cleanly, the Hercules rolling forward without reverse thrust from the failed engines. Sophia used aerodynamic drag and wheel brakes to slow the momentum. The emergency vehicles pacing them from the side, the aircraft finally coming to a complete stop near the waiting crews. For a moment there was only silence, a stillness that came not from calm, but from the release of tension. Then the sound began, a low ripple of applause from the cargo hold that grew into a deep roar. Battle-hardened Marines, Rangers, SEALs, and Air Force specialists clapping and shouting their thanks. Sophia powered down the aircraft and removed her headset, standing in the doorway of the cockpit as soldiers turned to see the journalist they had barely noticed earlier. A Marine gunnery sergeant stepped forward, his voice rough but filled with respect as he asked who she really was. She gave her name, Major Sophia Steele, United States Air Force retired, the words carrying a weight she had not spoken aloud in years. Emma looked at her, almost disbelieving, asking why she had not mentioned earlier. Sophia's answer was simple. She was not active duty anymore. She was a journalist now. But once a pilot, always a pilot. The days after the landing moved quickly, yet each one carried the echo of those 16 minutes in the air. The Pentagon requested a full report. The crew provided statements, and the names of everyone involved began moving through channels that rarely paid attention to journalists. Sophia's military record, once a quiet line on a resume, was now pulled in full from archives, the medals, the combat hours, the distinguished service, all laid out in black and white for those who had never guessed. The truth. The story spread quietly at first, told in barracks and briefing rooms. Pilots speaking of the journalist who had taken the controls of crippled C-130 and brought it home without loss of life. Within a week it reached military publications, the headlines calling her the journalist pilot, a title she did not seek, yet could not easily escape. The Secretary of the Air Force called her directly, offering an immediate return to active duty with a promotion, a seat once again in the cockpit. The offer carried weight, but Sophia knew her answer before the call even ended. She had found a different way to serve, one that allowed her to tell the stories of others while still carrying the knowledge that her hands could take the controls if called upon. She declined the return, but agreed to join the Air Force Reserve as an instructor pilot. Her time in the sky now spent teaching younger aviators the lessons that could never be learned in a classroom. When interviewed later for Air Force publications, Sophia spoke not about heroism, but about responsibility, about the danger of hiding the skills that could make a difference. She told them that service takes many forms, that sometimes life demands you become exactly what you were trained to be, even if you thought those days were behind you. Her words carried the weight of someone who had lived them, not just believed them. Back in her role with the Pentagon Press Corps, she continued covering military operations, walking the halls each morning with her press credentials hanging from her neck. On her desk sat two items side by side, her badge and the silver wings of a retired Air Force pilot, both symbols of service, different in function but equal in purpose. Every year on the anniversary of that flight, letters arrived from those who had been aboard, some short, others pages long. They wrote about the lives they had gone on to live, the families they had built, the missions they had continued, and the simple gratitude for the calm voice and steady hands that had guided them down when the sky seemed ready to take them. For Sophia, those letters were a quiet reminder that service does not always come in the form you expect, that sometimes the greatest acts happen not in the moments you plan, but in the ones that find you. She kept flying in the reserve, not for medals or recognition, but to pass on what she knew about leadership under pressure, decision-making in chaos, and valuing the lives entrusted to you above all else. In the end, the world still saw her as a journalist, a woman with a camera and a notepad moving through hangars and briefing rooms. But those who had been on Stallion 47 knew another side. They knew the truth that titles could not fully capture, that once a pilot, always a pilot, and that when the engines failed and the air thinned, Sophia Hart had done what needed to be done. And so the story of the quiet journalist who became a pilot once more lived on, not as a tale of glory, but as a reminder of what it means to serve. Whether in the cockpit or the newsroom, the mission remained the same: to be ready when it mattered most, and to bring everyone home.